So it's like you've got to hear these voices of justice and not cut them off from whatever you know as the gospel. And African Americans flag that text by singing about it, rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. I got a home into that rock, which has that verse, God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water but the fire next time. So that kind of signaling that this is important is what gives you that connection, that civic, we must make a better world, because you're going to have to answer for it.
Fantastic.
You're going to have to answer for it.
Greetings. I'm George McCarthy, president of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, and I'm here to welcome you to our house, the president's house of the Lincoln Institute, for a special Cambridge Forum. And I have three things to do here. One is to explain to you what the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy is. The other is to explain what land policy is, and then to explain why it is that we're interested in civil discourse, which is what the Cambridge Forum excels at. So first of all, the Lincoln Institute, we've been around for about 75 years, and our work is predicated on the idea that land policy rests at the leverage point between lots of important things we want to do in the world and getting them done. Things like, how do we really prepare to address the climate crisis? Or how do we preserve large habitats for endangered species? Or how do we find ways to fund our cities by deriving revenue from land through things like the property tax? Or how do we do things like plan the use of land and also exclude people from using land in certain ways? And for us, it's all about really finding ways to address kind of the pressing global issues in what we think are kind of ordinary but unknown ways that that are lost for most people. So for us, for 75 years, we've been advising governments at all levels, local, national, international. We work with big agencies like the UN and the World Bank. And we talk to them about ways in which they can kind of reconfigure in small ways a lot of the major things they're doing just to make the world work a little bit better using land policy. We work in the United States. We have an office in Beijing, China. We work in 19 countries in Latin America. We have a second office in Phoenix, Arizona, and we work remotely in Eastern Europe and in Africa as well. So we have a global footprint, and we have a big job, and now it's up to me to explain to you what land policy actually is. So land policy is kind of an interesting, it's a place in which we navigate between the private interests of people and the collective interests, and finding ways to use land so that we can protect property rights and people's actual claim over kind of the use and dominion over land, while at the same time making sure that that use does not harm the long-term sustainability of the planet or harm other people in the process. And so it's a vast area of work. As I mentioned, everything from climate change to land use planning to taxation to valuation, all of it is land policy. It's a big landscape, and one of the things about that landscape is it's hotly contested. There's few areas in the world where you can get people more steamed up than talking about how you want to abridge their ability to do something with their own land, or how we're going to use land differently than how they had planned to use it. Just talk to the people in Ukraine these days. The claims over land can be quite profound and really, really difficult. And that's why for us, it's really important to be able to have civil discourse to kind of navigate between those really, really pressing global interests, public interests, and private interests to get to a place where everybody can be treated fairly and justly. And one of our goals is to get land policy right, meaning that we understand that land policy has been often used historically in really bad ways, in ways that have excluded people from access to land or access to housing, access to financing on housing. All these different policies that when you can put red lines on a map and exclude people from being able to live there, to borrow money, to start businesses. We've been tracking structural racism in housing and land markets in the United States since the Great Depression, and it probably goes on even before then. And so for us, understanding kind of the good pieces and the bad pieces of land policy give us a kind of an avenue into actually solving some of these pressing problems. But for us, we rely on others to help us generate these kinds of moments of civil discourse, and that's why we're here partnered with the Cambridge Forum to talk about difficult discussions, hard topics. And today the topic isn't land policy, but today the topic is decades of work that the Cambridge Forum has done to really promote diverse voices. And we're going to hear a lot about that here today. And so to lead you through the rest of today's festivities, I'm going to introduce Mary Stack, the director of the Cambridge Forum, and she will lead us off. So Mary, it's all yours.
Hello, and a warm welcome to this very special recording of Cambridge Forum. We're coming to you live from the Lincoln Institute for Land Policy in Cambridge, and I'd like to begin by thanking George McCarthy, the director, and also the HSBA for enabling this event to actually happen. It's very special for a lot of reasons. One, this is our very first live event since the pandemic. Two, we've never been in this house doing a live recording before. And it's a watershed. An acknowledgement of Cambridge Forum's work over the past 50 years, covering various aspects of Black history, but also a current and candid discussion of what remains ahead. I can think of no one better to talk about this and open this event than Councillor Denise Simmons. She's devoted a good portion of her working life to chronicling and celebrating Black history. Welcome, Councillor Simmons.
Thank you, Mary, and a special thanks to Mac. I think he really did a great job at contextualizing this evening's conversation. What Mary failed to say, and she gives herself so little credit, we were putting this together during the pandemic, trying to figure out ways we could have that difficult conversation. You know, Cambridge likes to be that place where we can do it. If you can have the conversation, you can do it in Cambridge. If you can make change, you can do it in Cambridge. And so I am just over the moon pleased to be here with Mary and Denise Gilson. I call them my co-conspirators in getting into good trouble. And that's what we're going to do here this night. We're going to get into some good trouble. So thanks so much, Mary, for having this evening's event, putting this together. The program, Black History on Rewind. What an important topic. What an important title. And it's really special to me, near and dear to my heart, as someone who is always looking to delve into history, to ask those hard questions about who are we? Who were we? And who do we want to be? And I'm excited about how we delve into that conversation in this particular context, in this house that has so much historical resonance. When I think about this exercise in 2022, after all that we have been through, it's been an unquestionably fraught, tumultuous era. I think, I end up speaking for myself, we're still recovering from one of the most turbulent presidencies this nation has ever known. I don't know if we even recovered. Still contending with those aftershocks. We're in the process of the trauma of coming through a pandemic. And then, of course, there's the war in Ukraine. It's really a lot for us all to take in. And as difficult and turbulent the presidency of President Biden's predecessor has made it for us all, it has forced us to look at some very important truths. Truths about this country. Truths about how fragile our institutions are, how fragile democracy is. You know, what remains, what came out of the civil rights movement? Where are we now? Have we moved far enough? Or have we moved far but are being pushed back? One thing that's very, very clear to me, that this thing called democracy is very fragile. And that if we don't work very hard to keep it, we run the risk of having it rolled back, erased, even removed. And that's why our study of history is just so important. That delving deeply into the things that have happened here, having an honest reckoning of what has transpired in our country is going to be so critical to how we put together our future. And where better to take that journey but right here in Cambridge. We are steeped in history here. Cambridge is a city where Harvard University was founded 140 years prior to the outbreak of the War of Independence, with a city where General Washington first assumed control of the Continental Army, the city where ideas around the abolition of slavery firmly took root, and the equality of women, where these discussions, these movements, these opportunities were advanced. For centuries, it has all happened right here in Cambridge. Our streets are rich and imbued with a rich history that is forever reverberating forward. The ghosts of the past are never truly done with us, however, because those stories that have been passed down from generation to generation that have shaped our understanding, well, in a way, these stories are very critical, and we tend to name elements of our public spaces in honor of those who've had a prominence in our history. But it's also important to have a discussion about who we have looked over, who we have marginalized, who we have forgotten, who stands in the shadows of our history. And I think it's important upon us as a city, it's incumbent upon us as a city to not only to reason with that, to grapple with it, to recognize it, and to course correct it. And so I can't be more pleased to be here this evening as we have this important conversation, as we turn the soil, where we dig down, because the fact that we acknowledge women and Black people and people of color. We have Women's History Month and Black History Month. And I think that has given us an excuse to say, oh, we've covered all the bases. We've talked about women, we've talked about Black folks, we have Gay History Month, but that is not an excuse. It's an opportunity for us to do more. So I can't be more thrilled to be here this evening. I look forward to the discussion. I'm so happy that you're here. And so very special thanks to you, Mary, for all your work, to Denise Gilson and the HSBA, to Mac and the Lincoln Institute, and to our esteemed speakers. I am in the company of giants, and this is really quite the pleasure. So let's have a great evening. Mary, back to you.
Now it's time to introduce our speakers and our moderator. Randall Kennedy, Harvard law professor, appeared at the forum back in 2002 when he had first published Nigger, The Strange Career of a Troublesome Word. 20 years later, he has just reissued the book, unchanged, except for the foreword, in conjunction with a new book, Say It Loud. Cheryl Townsend Jilks is Professor of African American Studies and Sociology at Colby College and Assistant Pastor at Union Baptist Church in Cambridge. She first appeared at the forum in 2001 when she published If It Wasn't for the Women, which looked at the role of Black women and the church within the civil rights movement. Professor Jilks is currently working on a book about the horrors of slavery. Danielle Allen is director of the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard and is both a classics and a government scholar. In 2021, she took temporary leave to run for governor of Massachusetts, but is now returning to academia. Professor Allen has appeared twice in the forum in recent years, once moderating a discussion of no justice, no peace, race and power in America, and then she returned in 2017 to talk about her memoir, Cuz. Welcome to you all, and thank you for making the time. And now let me introduce you to our moderator, Roberto Mighty. He's a public TV producer and filmmaker who directed the PBS documentary Legacy of Love about the relationship between Martin Luther King and Coretta Scott King. Yeah. He's also America's first artist in residence at a National Historic Landmark cemetery and has made 29 films about cemeteries. including Mount Auburn. Without further ado, let me give it over to you, Roberto.
Well, on my way here today, I was driving along listening to the radio, and I heard the very first part of the confirmation hearing of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. And I have to say, I got a little choked up there. And luckily, there weren't other people in the adjacent lanes as I was driving. But why was it so emotional for me? And I'm just going to throw this out as we begin our conversation with the three of you. What's happened in America that brings us to this point? In 2022, the very first time that an African-American woman is being nominated for Supreme Court Justice. What brought us to this point? Why, you don't know me very well, but why do I feel that this is so, what made me want to cry about this? Why is this so important? Who would like to begin with this one?
I'll take a shot.
Thank you.
I can imagine you're feeling choked up, because I felt choked up too. And I think that there are two things that are going on. One, why is it taking so long? So the fact that this is a first says something that's an indictment of our country. And that's something about which everyone should be very sad. We all know why. And it has to do with race, it has to do with gender. And there's a very, there's sad tales to be told about that history. On the other hand, that's right. She is being, she's gotten this far. Mm-hmm. And there is a tremendous struggle that has been waged to make this day possible. Mm. And I think that's a reason why a lot of people feel very happy. And so, we see this not only today, but probably we see it, every day. We see it in lots of different contexts. On the one hand, the sad tale of the betrayal of democracy in America. Mm-hmm. At the same time, we do see breakthroughs. We do see progress. I mean, I bet that she will be confirmed, and that will be wonderful. We see these marks of progress, and so I think that it's those two things conjoined that I bet has something to do with your being choked up, and I'm sure they have something to do with my being choked up.
That's fantastic. Cheryl, you among your many writings is writings about the role of black women in the church. When Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson was speaking today, she used the word God several times, and she spoke about her faith and how important her faith is. With your background as a pastor at a Baptist church here in Cambridge, and also as a scholar, what do you think, again, bringing us to this moment, not really speaking about her, I don't really want to get into her confirmation hearings too much, but what leads us to this point?
Well, one of the things that I enjoyed reading her biography was her skill as an orator, as a debater, and the traditions within the African American experience, which had encouraged people to lift up their voices, to raise their voices, and to realize that this woman, who is a champion debater, falls into the tradition of Barbara Jordan, who was a champion debater. There's what we would call a parachurch organization. The Interdenominational Church Ushers Association has a series of scholarship contests that start at the local level, go to the regional level. Once a year, it's piano. Once a year, it's voice. But then the third year, it is oratory, because if you can't sing, if you can't play an instrument, you can stand up and speak. And you write an essay, memorize it, and deliver it. And it goes, as I said, local, regional, and then national. And Barbara Jordan was a national winner. And we know the consequences there. Dorothy Height, another woman who came through the African American tradition of oratory, she was the national winner from the Black Elks. And that gave her a 4-year scholarship. And she applied to Barnard, and she arrived. She was accepted. She arrived, and she walked in with her papers, and they told her that we're sorry, but we have a quota, and the other person got here first. You'll have to wait a year. And she took all of her papers and got on the subway and went to NYU and walked into the admissions office. Can't do that nowadays, but here is this wonderful woman. She goes and she shows them her credentials, and they admit her on the spot. She finishes in 3 years, and the Elks tell her, well, you still have another year on your scholarship, and she gets her graduate degree. And we know what Dr. Dorothy Height has done. So when I read about her story, I saw those stories, the various women who had Nanny Helen Burroughs, whose voices, even though there were exclusionary practices toward them as ministers, for instance, they still found a way to get their voices heard and to encourage young people to raise their voices. Somebody came to my office one day. They wanted to interview me about my, because I'm up there in Maine, and, I'm a little bit of an oddball. And they wanted to know, well, how does your work here at the college, your leadership role, affect what you do at church? And I said, it's the other way around. My church trained me for my roles here. It's being a Baptist and going to meetings, going to conventions, having a Sunday school superintendent who insisted that the young people go to conventions, take notes, and come back and give oral reports to the church. That was the kind of cultural capital that was poured into us even when we didn't have doors open to us. And so when I read her biography, I was like, you go, girl.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And Danielle, in your work, you put a lot of emphasis on, first of all, public service. Your nonprofit, your record of nonprofit service is nonpareil. You have even run for office, right, here in Massachusetts. What do you think about this idea, the notion of someone like yourself, who is an intellectual, a very well-educated person, an author, and so forth, someone like a Ketanji Brown Jackson. What do you feel about the role that people should have in public service, who have so many privileges given to them? And I'm quoting her, by the way, when I say it.
Absolutely. Well, my daughter is also really excited about the nomination and anticipated appointment of our future Justice, Ketanji Brown Jackson. And my daughter likes to say that she wants to just celebrate what she calls blurs, black nerds. All right, so here we have in our Justice another black nerd. And like you, I also have had other names and shadows in my spirit as I have watched the story of her life and hearings. And we were talking earlier about the first African-American woman to earn a law degree, Sadie Tanner Alexander, in the 1920s. So it's taken us 100 years, to Randall's point about how long it's taken. There has always been black excellence. There's always been black excellence. And Martin Luther King Jr., in Testament of Hope, I think it was one of his last essays, said, the really important thing is we have to get to a place of full sharing of power and responsibility. He said, that's going to be the hardest for us. And that's what we're really watching, where we've had generations, centuries of black excellence. And the question is, how do you hook that up to full sharing of power and responsibility? That's what we're watching now. And yes, I mean, we've got blurs, black nerds all over the place, serving in all kinds of ways. And I think all across the country, it's a moment for looking at the question of how do we remove barriers to full participation in that full sharing of power and responsibility. So we have to move from excellence to that full sharing. I think that's the work at hand.
Fantastic. Now, you brought up Martin Luther King, and let's turn to you. You wrote a fabulous piece about the role of Martin Luther King, rather what people have forgotten about Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech. I read that piece, and I was deeply moved about your thinking process. What have people forgotten about Martin Luther King and his speech. And we're going to get to Coretta Scott King too, but what have they forgotten?
Well, up at the college where I teach, we actually did a course one time on the sociology of Dr. Martin Luther King. He was a sociology major. And you can see the sociological analysis, hear it. We used Testament of Hope at one point, and the students, when they finished reading it, they said, what he's talking about then is still important now. That was number one. Number two, they were amazed at what had happened after 1963, after this speech, which was not originally an I Have a Dream speech. He had talked about the dream at the Detroit March that was organized by C.L. Franklin, Aretha Franklin's father. And Mahalia Jackson had been there at that march. He had the speech. And really what was happening was Let Freedom Ring was in that speech. And Mahalia Jackson, like a Baptist congregation, leaned forward, and another woman raising her voice to be heard, telling about the dream, Martin. So he like bringing an engine into an already built car frame, he brought that in and then proceeded. But the Let Freedom Ring, most people don't pay attention to the places he is speaking of in that Let Freedom Ring speech. And he talks about Lookout Mountain in Tennessee. And then he talks about Stone Mountain in Georgia. And those were hardcore Klan shrines that he was speaking to. He was speaking to that tradition and once students know what those places are, but they don't know. They hear the oratory, but they don't know what he's talking about in terms of a holistic vision of the United States that he lifted up in that speech. He goes on after that speech to continue to write and to continue to organize in so many ways. And reading his Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community, you find him talking about many of the actions in our society or the inactions in our society that needed to be addressed. And he used the word racism when he's talking about cultural erasure, the need, the problem of the miseducation, not only of Black people, but also of white people. And where have we gone from there? As Councilor Simmons said, yes, we have Black History Month. Yes, we have the variety of history months, but we also have changing curricula that actually include. And we are in battle over those curricula because they are effectively including. And people are misrepresenting the battle as critical race theory. If they actually knew what critical race theory was, they would, oh my goodness, they would run because it's difficult reading. The real stuff is difficult reading. But the fact that we are battling over this still it's a good thing. It's a terrible thing. But the fact that it's on the public table, it's no longer confined to the segregated Black schools of 1926. It's no longer confined to our church settings, which was my first engagement with what we call Negro History Week. And my father, who was born in 1919, would occasionally slip and say Negro History Week, but he was the youth director who brought in the film and had us learn about Haiti and so many other things. So it's both growth. As you say, we've come so far, and yet there is still so much to do. But it's a discovery process. Making change is like scientific discovery. Once you learn this, what's the next step? What's the next step? What do we see? And Dr. King made us see that after we got the big rock of Jim Crow, that legal structure out of the way. And one of the things that I used as a teaching tool in my classroom was Pauli Murray's compilation called States Laws of Race and Color, where you see all the laws that existed in the 48 states in 1950. I'd go into class and say, pick a state. And one time I had this young man, one of my favorite I don't have favorite students. But this young man, to be fresh, he goes, Idaho. And when we got through going through that list to see the laws that tried to exclude and effectively excluded
Chinese immigrants from owning land, the Alien Land Act. And most people don't realize Idaho had the largest mass lynching of any state. And not a mass killing, because we start to think of St. Helena, Arkansas, and Tulsa, etc., but a mass lynching of Chinese immigrants. 17 and 1 killing. Then you realize that race is something that's been throughout the United States. The fact that this white supremacist wanted to move to Idaho and start an all-white town, and then he did 23andMe and discovered he was 14% African. It was just God has a good sense of humor. But these are the kinds of things that we have to learn and teach so that people understand, yes, we've come forward, but now that we got the big rock of Jim Crow out the way, we still have this tremendous structure of inequality that has been effectively deposited with the help of Jim Crow. And how do we deal with that now?
Fantastic. Thank you. That was fantastic. Over to you, please, Danielle.
Well, and land is at the center of the story. It was at the center of the story you just told. We're sitting here at a Land Institute. I actually thought that was a really extraordinary way to start. And as we look around the world, and we do have incredible inequality. If you just take Massachusetts as an example, there's a staggering racial wealth gap. So, the median wealth held by a white family in Boston is about $250,000. For an African-American family, it's about $8. You look at life expectancy. New Bedford, life expectancy is about 68, in Newton, 94. You see these incredible differentials. And at the end of the day, the story of land use is actually really at the heart of that. We have a housing crisis in the country, the whole country. Definitely have a housing crisis here in Massachusetts. And the way in which access to land has been restricted over time is at the center of that racial wealth gap. And so much else flows from that in terms of access to health and the other kinds of resources that bring well-being. So, Cheryl is absolutely right that it was one thing to move aside the legal structure of Jim Crow, but there's just a huge amount of work to do, actually, to move forward towards transformation, move our institutions, our legal structures to full participation of all people. So some of that is ballot access for running for office, some of that is voting rights, but then it is also things like approaching land use in different ways that really opens up mobility and opportunity and affordability and gives people a chance to build wealth. So there's a lot more that can be said about that policy nitty-gritty, but I really appreciated the history that Cheryl sketched.
Fantastic. In your current book, Say It Loud, it's 39 essays. What are some of the issues that pertain to this period? Let's say, take the past 25 years. What are some of the issues that you identify that you are most concerned about? And you are famous for being dispassionate, but I'm going to say passionate about as well, in terms of where we are headed. How if we take this moment, we have this Supreme Court justice being nominated versus the past 25 years. What are some of the top issues that you're most concerned about?
Well, in that book, the very first essay, in a way, echoes much of the conversation that we've been having, because the first essay in the Say It Loud is an essay called "Shall We Overcome?" And what the essay is about it's about two large traditions of thinking in America about race. One tradition is the pessimistic tradition. It's the tradition that says, no, we shall not overcome. It's the tradition that suggests that our history of racism is insuperable. And there are very smart people, very impressive people who have held that position. Among the people who've held that position would be Alexis de Tocqueville, Thomas Jefferson, Abraham Lincoln. In the black nationalist tradition, it would be Malcolm X. It would be my colleague Derek Bell, the permanence of racism. On the other hand, there is an optimistic tradition. And we've heard a good bit about the optimistic tradition. In the optimistic tradition, the great spokesperson in the 19th century would be the great Frederick Douglass, who made speeches, around here, around here.
That's right.
Great speeches. In fact, even before the abolition of slavery, Douglass was once asked, "Do you foresee a time when people of different races can be neighbors and encounter one another as equal and as neighbors?" And even before the abolition of slavery, he said, "Yes, I can foresee that day." In the 20th century, the great spokesperson would be Martin Luther King Jr. If one takes a look at his first speech as a civil rights activist, December 5th, 1955, announcing the Montgomery bus boycott. And then, of course, I Have a Dream, 1963, and hours before he was killed. I've been to the mountaintop. I might not get there with you, but I have seen the promised land. I mean, he was the great optimist. Now, in the 21st century, probably the most consequential racial optimist would be Barack Obama. But we're still struggling with this, and I have to say, I have been an optimist for my adult life. I have to say that my optimism is, I'm still in the optimistic camp, but I'm a chastened optimist. I think I was frankly a little bit on the complacent side. And at this moment, I'm filled with trepidation. I have hope, but I also have more fear.
What
about
are some
the
of the
state
things that concern you the most?
Well,
Pick one, right?
here's one. Here's one. So, if one were to ask, what was the most important legislative action taken during the Second Reconstruction? What was the most effective single statute passed during the period between 1950 and 1970, the Second Reconstruction? I think somebody can make a very strong argument that the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was the most important, the most effective. Well, the Supreme Court recently, in other words, our Supreme Court, has eviscerated the Voting Rights Act of 1965. If you had asked me 15 years ago, can you imagine the evisceration of the Voting Rights Act of 1965? I said, no. Well, it has happened. And not only has it happened, but we see that vote suppression is on the march. And our present Supreme Court, unfortunately, doesn't seem to be in a mind to take that on. And so I'm very worried. And you mentioned, at the outset, you mentioned the struggle over the presidency. January 6th should be on people's mind. There was an effort to take over the Capitol. There was an effort to prevent the peaceful transfer of executive power in the United States. So again, I'm hopeful. I'm hopeful in part because of efforts that are undertaken by millions of Americans, but I'm also worried.
Okay. Let's go over to you, Danielle. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure.
You believe in working within government, yes? And how on earth could you believe, based upon what we've just, what we've heard and what we are all experiencing since, arguably, the election of Barack Obama as president? Yeah. How do you have hope? I know you do have hope for the role people in government to make change that's meaningful and lasting. Just unpack why do you hope?
Sure. I really appreciate the categories that Randall gave us, the pessimists and the optimists. And I always like to say there's a third category. That's what I put myself in, which is the failure is not an option category. So I'm not an optionist. So I'm not exactly an optimist, I'm not exactly a pessimist, but failure is not an option, not an optionist. And my personal model for that is Ralph Ellison. It's another figure. He's always hard to place in the categories. And Ellison said in notes to his unfinished posthumous novel, Juneteenth, there was a note that said, "The society is unlikely to become free of racism. Therefore, it's necessary for Negroes to become their idea of what a free people should be." Mm-hmm. And that has always captured my way of being in the world. Mm-hmm. And it is a view that if you enact freedom, if you enact empowerment, the world changes around you. And in so doing, you open up space for possibility. So that's more or less what guides me in the work that I do. I do think it's a perilous moment, though, and I want to just sort of share a little bit of my own sense of the peril. So I have, among other things, had the pleasure of writing for the Washington Post for a long stretch of time, and I wrote a huge number of columns in 2015 and 2016. I wrote my heart out arguing against the election of Donald Trump. It felt like it made, exactly zero difference. But in the course of doing that, I got a huge amount of hate stuff, phone calls and emails and tweets, the whole kit and caboodle. It's all very familiar to us at this point. And nooses and pictures of gas ovens and things like that. And it was having an effect on me. I mean, to the point of my feeling like I'm not sure I want to go outside. Like all these people, like, who are the ones who actually hate me? Like, who are these anonymous faces doing this? And so I asked a friend of mine in the sort of tech space to do an analysis for me, particularly of the tweets that were coming at me, sort of where they were coming from. And I was really surprised, and this was before we had all of the U.S. intelligence analyses of the election. They were mostly coming from Eastern Europe.
Wow.
Okay?
Fascinating.
And there truly is an international network, and troll farms operating in Eastern Europe in particular, but not just there, an international network of far-right extremists who have been proactively building coalitions around the world, including in this country, stirring the pot. Mm-hmm. We are vulnerable in this country because we do have a history of racism, and we have enduring racism in this country. But what we are seeing is not just coming from us and from our own people. And it's really quite specific even. So, I mean, this is in the U.S. intelligence report that was released in analyzing Russia's role in the election. Mm-hmm. There was a moment in Texas where Russian engagement on Facebook literally generated both an anti-Islamic protest against sort of Islamic migration and a pro-Islamic protest on opposite sides of the street, counter-protesting each other. Mm-hmm. So that is the degree to which our division is being stirred up. But I tell the story about myself and the direct impact it had on me psychologically, because I want to make the point that, even if it's coming from, to some meaningful extent, outside, it is actually changing us and our relations to one another. Right. And so I think our negative experiences with each other, have become real. They've been provocateurs driving and stirring, but they have made our relations with one another worse. So in that regard, I think we need to see the many different actors in the world who are taking advantage of our hard history, our history of domination. And so the question is, how do we actually have enough faith in ourselves as a people to find the place to build from and to block off those who are really seeking intentionally to sow division, on behalf of a project of extremism.
This is fascinating. You mentioned Alexis de Tocqueville earlier, didn't you mention de Tocqueville? And it's an interesting idea that's right. Well, that's right. That throughout our history as a nation, there have always been outside actors who were coming in, observing, and also, putting in ideas. Just over to you just for a moment, Cheryl. When I was working on my own King project, I became aware of what some people call the Black church tradition, and there's another fancier term for it that's escaping me right now. But the idea was that the religious civic leaders should look into the Bible for evidence in Scripture for how to comport ourselves in the political and civic world. And I'm so sorry, I'm blanking on the. There's a better academic term for this movement. I hope you can edit this.
I
I
have no idea.
Okay.
I know the whole tradition of the preacher having the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other hand.
Okay.
There are traditions because the civic leadership, when you start to look at, who becomes prominent as civic leaders, they are very often also ministers. That class, that new class that emerged with the end of slavery, I call them the educators, but they were the preachers and the teachers.
Yes.
And that was, you did both and.
Yes.
What you were talking about, this is not an option, the pessimist versus the optimist, but yet there's the ethic of being there. How do we build as we climb anyway? And I think that was an important component. When you look at some of the most prominent of, for instance, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., coming from before social scientists began to use the term megachurch, you had Abyssinian in New York, you had Concord in Brooklyn, you had these churches that could, in fact, have an impact on local elections if they had the vote. You had the consequence, what happened when candidate Kennedy took the trouble to call Mrs. King. And his brother made an effort to try to, because they were really afraid that Dr. King, if he was sent to that prison farm, would not come back alive. Dying in penitentiaries and jails in the South was it was normal. As a child, when you were talking about both of these traditions, my parents, bless my parents, I had a very well curated childhood. They would not buy a television because they were afraid I would not read. So when I ran out of library books, I had to read the Afro-American, the Pittsburgh Courier, the Boston Chronicle that were delivered to the house. And then when my great aunt moved in with us, I had to read the Amsterdam News. So I can remember reading these newspapers when I got through. And there was this one article, I was a little kid, and I'm like, Mommy, what's this word? Segregation. Because she made me sound out the words. Right. And the article was about de jure. I now know it's de jure, but when you're a little kid, it's, one E on the end of the one. De jure and de facto. And I can remember reading this and say, okay, what are they going to think up next? To have that kind of attitude, but then you go to work on it. Then your ears are on when you go to church. When one of our pastors, who was a signatory on the Committee of Negro Churchmen in their response to Black Power. His name was Herbert O. Edwards, a graduate of Harvard. He pastored us twice, his master's degree and his doctoral degree. And he preached a sermon on love. As a little kid, I remembered all 3 Greek words. When I got to seminary, I realized I had had this wonderful education. So the role of these pastors and their allies, the missionaries, especially when we're talking about the gendered reality of leadership in African American churches, took very seriously the prophetic tradition. How do we talk about justice, and who gives us permission to talk about justice? And for instance, the spiritual rock of my soul in the bosom of Abraham. Bosom of Abraham only shows up one place in the Bible. And it's the story in Luke 16 where the rich man and Lazarus happen. And Lazarus, who is poor, who has sores, the dogs lick his sores, he would have been happy to eat the crumbs from the rich man's table. He ends up in heaven, and the rich man ends up in torment. And he's like, send somebody to my brother. And the voice comes from heaven and says, if one should rise from the dead, and they hear not Moses and the prophets, it won't do them any good if one should come back from the dead. And it's Jesus telling the story. So it's like, you've got to hear these voices of justice and not
cut them off from whatever you know as the gospel. And African Americans flag that text by singing about it, rocking my soul in the bosom of Abraham. I got a home into that rock, which has that verse, God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water but the fire next time. So that kind of signaling that this is important is what gives you that connection, that civic, we must make a better world, because you're going to have to answer for it.
Fantastic.
You're going to have to answer for it on the other side of the river.
There you go.
For the
That's
healing
why
of the
failure is
nations.
not an option, because you're going to have to answer for
That's
it.
right.
All right.
Well, let's take another tack here, and
Sean.
yeah, that was
Sean.
fantastic. I'm kind of like you get. Someone's testifying.
They gave us, our ancestors gave us such great material.
Yes.
We've got to share it.
That's
I
great.
bet you're a fan of Mary McLeod Bethune.
Very much so.
Yep.
Yeah.
Very
Yeah.
much
My
so.
dad was too.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just wrote something where I talked about her legacy. Oh, when I did the meditations on Black History Month for my church, one of them I read her last will and testament. I leave you love. You know, the importance that the great ones chose love. Thurman, Bethune, Martin Luther King. That somehow, regardless of what happens, you still have to persevere with this thing called love. The agape love that sees other human beings. And yes, they may be wrong. Yes, they may be angry, but they are human beings. God created human beings. So yes, I'm a fan of
Okay.
Cloud Bethune.
All right. A new tack now here. So in your book, Cuz, you write about your cousin and his experience, which is not a blurred experience, the black, nerd, which is an entirely different experience. So I just want to talk about this issue of classism in the African American experience, how that has changed in the last, again, I'm trying to sort of steer us to looking at the past 25 years, more or less, and just talk about, a bit of your personal experience, but then how you see that, how that gives you a broader perspective as someone who's really, truly operating in the public sphere.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. So I grew up in California in the 70s, and my dad's family was from northern Florida. He grew up in a family of 12 kids. Half of them moved to Southern California. My mom was from Michigan. They met there. But so we were this huge family, extended family, lots of, literally countless numbers of cousins, basically, all growing up together. And we were all growing up, sort of in that zone, working class or lower middle class, basically. Everybody working hard, getting ahead. Obviously, the 70s were hard in all kinds of ways, but there was definitely a sense of opportunity when I was a kid. And my experience over the 50 years of my lifetime is really the experience of the country, where there's just been this incredible pulling apart, right? And that was really the point where we still were not, inequality was not that bad in the 70s. Like, we were still benefiting from the war economy and so forth, and that was a sort of low level of inequality in the country. And over the last 50 years, we've just pulled apart with the 1%, just taking incredible share of the overall productivity of the country. And in my family as well. I mean, basically, some of us got rocketed up on elevators of opportunity to the highest levels of privilege. And others were trapped and dragged down into the worst that this country has to offer, and incarceration and police beating. And my cousin Danielle, there were two of us, there were two Danielle Allens in this big brood, dead from opioid substance use disorder issues, basically. And so, I think for African American families, there's sort of scarcely a family that hasn't felt that incredible pulling apart. And we work really hard, right, to hold ourselves together as families. And to, in that regard, just as a matter of being a family, you find yourself trying to push against the dynamics of the country as a whole and society as a whole. And I had a good conversation last week that Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley participated in, and former Boston City Councilor Andrea Campbell, now candidate for Attorney General here in Massachusetts. We're all part of it, and Andrea was observing, all of us seeking public service or participating in public service have direct experiences of mass incarceration. Yeah. We carry that with us. I lost my beloved cousin Michael in 2009. That was a life-changing moment for me. Lost him to a combination of mass incarceration and gun violence, and I carry with that with me everywhere and everything I do. It absolutely defines how I see the world that we're in right now. And it doesn't matter where you are across the fabric of our society. Most African Americans have direct experience of mass incarceration at this point in time. And so it's a hard truth. It's a profound truth. It also, I think, just underscores how important it is, back to your question about political institutions, that, as Ayanna Pressley always says, the people closest to the pain are closest to the power. We do need public servants, African-American public servants, to step up and to lead, because we are the ones who are in the best position to steer things in a different direction from the destruction of the last 50 years, which has been extraordinary.
Fantastic. Randall, in your work, I would say that, if you don't mind my saying so, that your work sort of skims across the very top of American rhetoric. Frankly, all three of you, your work skims across the top layer of American rhetoric, American writing about the state of America, and so forth. However, I'm just going to ask you to sort of, just take a look again at the last 20 years, since your first book, your first widely published popular book, which you've now reissued with a new introduction, to now. Do you think that there is some sort of backlash that happened as a result of the not only the election of Barack Obama, which of course there was a backlash, but since other Black politicians have become more prominent, and Black leaders in various spheres of American society?
Yes, exclamation point. Yes. And I mean, the fact of the matter is, there have been many backlashes. The Second Reconstruction generated a tremendous backlash.
Yes.
I mean, we began our conversation with talking about the Supreme Court.
Right.
Well, 1968, Richard Nixon ran for the presidency saying, if you elect me, I will put into place at the Supreme Court what he called strict constructionists. And everybody knew what he meant.
Yes.
Well, he was successful. We've had a very conservative Supreme Court since then, since Nixon. Nixon put in 4 justices, and that was a reaction. Then, of course, what has occurred since the presidency, and during and subsequent to the presidency of Barack Obama, to say reaction is actually, I mean, there has been a reaction, there has been backlash. Those words seem a little bit tame.
Yes.
I mean, frankly, I think that we've seen a certain amount of, actually a considerable amount of just out and out derangement. And one can sort of understand it. I mean, after all, there have been millions of people who have been socialized in the United States of America to think that, of course, the President of the United States is going to be white. Of course, the White House is going to be the house in which a white family is resident. Of course, white people are going to be on top. I mean, this is a white man's country, and millions of people have been socialized in that way. It wasn't their fault; they've been socialized in that way. And then Barack Obama, and then they turn on the television and they see black people who are anchors and commentators. They go to schools and they see my colleagues here. I mean, seriously, it's like, hold it. Something must be askew. And we are actually seeing the upshot of that. This whole thing going on with the schools and, history and, what? So you have these people, this black woman at the New York Times is going to write a book that's going to be, in popular terms, probably the most influential book in the last few years about American history.
The
1619 Project. People are going, it has gotten under people's skin. And, it's made people act in just outrageous ways. And, that is going to be the state of things, I suspect, for a good long while. Now, again, I don't want to lose sight. I want to keep perspective. There is a good side to that story. The good side of that story, well, yeah, there is a good side.
Okay.
The good side is they were reacting to something.
Okay.
They were reacting to initiatives. They were enacting to progress. And we should not forget that.
Yeah.
We have to be attentive to racism in American life. We also have to be attentive to the long, strong tradition of anti-racism in American life. We have to know about John C. Calhoun, that's right, but we also have to know about William Lloyd Garrison, Charles Sumner, other people who have given their all to the anti-racist struggle in America.
So you're describing what some people would call good white people, in other words. In other words, you're saying that there have been white people who have been anti-racist, in fact, all along, and so you're saying that you don't feel that they're getting enough attention? Is that, I'm not quite sure.
No, I don't think they are getting enough attention. And by the way, I
James
like
Otis. I like to always stick up for James Otis.
Okay.
I like that's right. That's right. And we shouldn't.
1760s.
We spoke earlier about the second Reconstruction. James Reeb.
Yes.
Yes, Unitarian
From
minister.
Boston, here.
That's right.
Yep.
Graduate of Princeton
yes.
Seminary.
Don't forget Michael
Viola
Schwerner.
Liuzzo.
Don't forget Viola Liuzzo. I mean, that's right. There have been people.
And from the beginning. I mean, that's really an
Absolutely.
important point.
And one of the problems in America, and I try to get my students to understand that when we look at some of the laws, especially during slavery, they didn't pass laws against reading because you don't pass laws against human behavior that does not exist. You make it illegal for slaves to learn to read because some slaves have learned to read, and there were people who wanted to teach them. I did an oral history with a woman who's, when I arrived at her house, this was about 1977, and she was already 85 years old, and she had a photo album with 6 generations of women in her family: her granddaughter, her daughter, herself, her mother, her grandmother, and her great-grandmother. Her great-great-grandmother had been enslaved on the plantation next door to George Washington's and had watched him ride off to take command of the troops. And the woman who owned the plantation was a widow from the North. And she had a school on her plantation where she was teaching people to read and write. Wow. And she was explaining to me how the tradition of literacy was implanted in her family. But they referred to this woman's property as Mrs. So-and-so's free N-word because they could write themselves passes and come and go as they please. But that whole tradition, and what the South would do was pass laws against people like that. And if people wanted to pass property to their progeny,
right,
they would take them into court, break their wills, have them defined as crazy, and then they pass laws against manumission. And you see that constant struggle. But you have to teach people how to read just that legal legacy, those historical legacies, so they can see what behaviors are involved. John Hope, who's from Atlanta University, his father, who was white, changed his racial classification so he could marry. I mean, we don't tell those stories, and we need to tell those stories because it's part of what has made this nation. Du Bois asked the question when at one of his conferences, we need to study those who could have left the race and ask the question, why did they stay? So, even when we're talking about these issues of class and status, et cetera, there's so much more to learn.
Okay. Yep. How are we doing on time? 5 minutes left. Okay. This is so exciting. I feel like I want to just quickly get into the role of women. It happens to be something that my own work is often about, women in history, like Coretta Scott and Edmonia Lewis and so forth and so on. But we've spoken a lot about racism in this conversation. But let's talk about misogyny just for, a moment. It deserves more than a moment, okay? And specifically, I asked a question about backlash against African-American. You mentioned African-American excellence early in this conversation. And, it sort of redounds to blacks getting elected. but when we look at the reaction to the squad, to African American women being elected to public office, it seems, am I wrong in feeling a particularly virulent strain of madness and hatred directed at these women? And it's relative to the fact that African American women who were, very and deeply involved in the civil rights, what we think of as the civil rights movement of the 50s, 60s, were pretty much pushed to the background, and correct me if I'm wrong about that. But how do we see this? How do we see this? We want to get African Americans to do public service, but then we are seeing a backlash against those people that in some ways gets us one step forward, two steps back.
It's very complicated.
Yeah, it is. And we only have 4 minutes now.
I know, exactly. So I'll just share one data point that was interesting to me as I was beginning to explore running for governor. And at this point, people have done a lot of research on what makes the difference for women running and the like. And one of the most surprising things is that the category of women who have the most success and the most immediate traction with the electorate are conservative African American, let's say Republican, specifically Republican African American women. More traction than white women of either party. And so it's basically liberal women of color are at the lowest level of traction, white women of either party, and then black women who are Republicans have the most traction. So figure out that riddle, puzzle that one, So there's some complicated dynamic, and maybe you can explain it.
Yeah.
I would say, now I know Massachusetts, okay, because my parents came here and they both died Republicans. And part of it is that it's because the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln. That's where folks started. Mm-hmm. And black women in the Republican Party, even though, as one woman told me, she was attorney Glendora Putnam. I don't know if you've ever met her. When she became unenrolled during the Obama election, 3 former governors, Republican governors, showed up at her door begging her to come back to the party. And she had been strong, done the work, and she talked about the change in the Republican Party that was pushing, when the last time she went to a Republican convention, feeling like she wasn't wanted there. But that tradition of African American women and men in the Republican Party is intergenerational and self-sustaining within the party. And I think that may be part of it, because even though I did not I only registered as a Republican one time to help Ed Brooke in a primary. Other than that, I've been a rebel Democrat. But Mrs. Newman, who was the Secretary of Labor, she was a state representative. I used to go to Republican club meetings with my dad. She had said to me, if you ever want to run for office, we're here for you. And how often do Democratic people of color have old line Democrats coming to them? My parents talked about their battles with the Democratic Party. And there's an ambivalence about the Democratic Party because, yes, it is the party to which people went when Roosevelt, we went in degrees, but you don't have that intergenerational, invitational component of the Republican Party that has been silenced with their move toward with the what do they call it, the Southern strategy during and after Nixon. Mm-hmm. Right. But I think that there's an intergenerational piece in there, and I interviewed folks. I did oral histories with women who were Republicans, and it was the ethic of being there. What you were talking about, it's not an option for people to be absent, and in a sense, they would say, I have to be there, because if I'm not there, nobody else is there. Sure. I met some folks in Texas who had that same attitude. Sure. We cannot be absent, even though this is awful.
All right, now I have to step in and say that I'm getting the high sign over there that we're no, we're out of time. Yep. So we're gonna just go over here and then there, and then we're gonna please.
Well, on that subject, I really don't have. I think it's a complicated thing. It seems to me that is there animus? Is there prejudice against women of all sorts, of all complexions? Yes, and that's a tremendous struggle that needs to be waged in American life. Is there animus? Is there prejudice? Are there low expectations with respect to race? Yes. And then, as Danielle was mentioning, a while ago, there's another problem about which we don't speak enough. I know I don't speak about it enough in my own work, and that, of course, is class. The class animus, class oppression, and we cover it up. Race, of course, has been used as a smokescreen and a way of diverting people. But we have, in America, we have a variety of struggles along various fronts. They intersect in all sorts of complicated ways, but they're all important, looming obstacles that we have to seek to overcome.
Very good.
Yep.
Last.
That's a heavy burden.
I'm sorry.
So no, I mean this has been such an important conversation, and I think to your point, there's lots to say about there's room for a similar conversation about where are we with women in history, and then all of the intersectional issues, as you know, sort of what are the different and sometimes confounding ways that race and gender interact or race and class. So I think it's never actually really a sort of straight linear story. Things are swirling all over the place in surprising ways. But I guess I will just come back to to Cheryl's sermon, and we have to answer for it on the other side. So failure is not an option. So
Amen.
There are barriers of all kinds, but we've got sharp elbows.
Yeah.
We make
Keep
room.
on pushing.
We make space. Exactly. And do that as a Black person, do that as a woman.
And say it
that's how I
loud.
do it.
Say it
Exactly.
loud.
We say it loud.
Well, thank all of you. This is fantastic and
Thank you.
great conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for a
Thank you.
terrific
Thank
job.
you.
Exactly.
And thank you, Mary
Moderating.
Staff,
Thank you.
for organizing and bringing us together.
We've just got to close it. Thanks to our wonderful guests on today's programme, Randall Kennedy, Cheryl Townsend-Julks and Danielle Allen, and to our fabulous moderator, Roberto Mighty. Again, let me thank the Lincoln Institute and Harvard Square Business for their generosity in making today's event possible. Cambridge Forum is underwritten by Herbert and Dorothy Vetter, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, the Lowell Institute, and Cambridge Community Foundation. Oh, and you. So if you feel inclined to write a check or send some money, don't let me hold you back. You can go to the website to sign up if you want to know more about our programs, www.cambridgeforum.org. There you'll find a whole plethora of podcasts of past programs, including this one, which will be up there shortly. We also make NPR broadcasts weekly, and this video will be uploaded by GBH Forum Network to YouTube within a week or so. So no shortage of ideas in the pipeline, and no shortage of great historical programs for you all to enjoy now that we've digitized. And what can I say, but this could have gone on for another couple of hours. You are wonderful dinner party guests.
Watch out. We're getting comfortable.
Thank you very much.